so that's it. So just to get going a little bit, Jamie Baker's with the law firm of Pierce Atwood that has, I think, 6 different cities. I just saw in Sweden. I've forgotten about Sweden. So primarily, I think it's Portland, Portsmouth, Boston, Sweden, maybe New York. I'm probably forgetting one. But Jamie is a good friend and a great friend to the Entrepreneurship Center, the E-Center, as is Pierce Atwood. Pierce Atwood actually sponsors our summer seed grant. For those of you that might be interested in that, those applications are due next Wednesday. And the summer seed grant is if you have an idea that you want to work on, continue to work on over the summer, you actually get paid to work on that idea. So your summer job is to work on your own idea. So those tend to be relatively early stage ideas. So even if you just have a sort of an idea of something you want to work on, do consider that. So go to the homepage and you'll see it right on the homepage under Summer Seed Grant. So make sure you apply by next Wednesday, the 10th. So it's always great to have Jamie on board. I always say the second most important thing after you have a good idea is to make sure you know what you're doing legally. So to protect your idea, protect your company, have a good partnership agreement, make sure that everything's there. There probably is really no more important thing once you have a really good idea. So Jamie's a graduate of Bentley College, went to law school at the University of Connecticut, works really a lot with startup companies, has spent countless hours over the last 5 years working with UNH student companies. So one of their deals as a partner with the E-Center is that for those students with ideas and pending companies is to provide some free legal services to them. So if that's of interest, always contact me about that going forward. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. We'll be back in later on to do the raffle, and again, remind people to drop in your email address portion for I2 Passport. So I'm going to do a screen share here, and hopefully it will work. So hold on for a sec. Everybody see that?
Nope, not showing.
Really? All right. Hold, please.
No,
there we go. How's that?
You're good.
Great. So Jamie, the floor is yours, and just let me know as we'll skip through the slides.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you, Ian, and the E-Center for having me back again. If I'm talking here, if you can hear me, Ian, can you give me a thumbs up so that it sounds good and we're good to go? Okay, great. I can see you. So, you know, I'm going to launch into, you know, some of the classic things that I talk or think about and talk to founders about when we're, you know, thinking about starting a company and getting things going. If any of you that are on the Zoom have questions or comments, or feel free to jump in along the way, because I think it'll be, you know, sort of hopefully more interesting and interactive to deal with any of those real life questions or comments that you might have. So feel free to jump in. It won't bother me in the least, and I think it might bring up some interesting points that we could all chat about. So I guess we can go to the maybe the third slide.
Oh, we just lost you there, Jamie.
The next one. So, you know, this is just a really quick reminder.
Is it me or is it, can everyone else hear?
Visual of the different stages of a company. And, you know, really what we're going to talk about here tonight is you have a great idea, you're interested in starting a company. That's, you know, probably why you're on this Zoom, and, you know, you've thought about starting a company either by yourself or with other people. And so, you know, you have a good idea, whether it's a nonprofit or a product or a consumer good or a piece of tech. And, you know, you want to theoretically turn it into something. So you have that idea. The next stage is, you know, is there really something there? Do we have a market? Are there people that we can sell it to? You know, getting to that next stage of maturity, and then, you know, building, scaling, you know, and mature companies. Those kind of speak for themselves. I'm sure, you know, you all know that, you know, as the company gets bigger, you know, you're talking about public companies or, you know, pretty big private companies that are out there. But it all starts, you know, kind of in the same way. Whether you're Google or Zoom that we're using right now, or Microsoft or Ford, it all starts just with a legal entity that somebody, you know, some small group or some person started at some point, because they wanted to start a company. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on tonight, is that initial sort of early stage startup mode, that a lot of the, you know, if you're up at UNH and you're thinking about starting a company, you're probably in that bucket. So the next slide. You know, this is not to be preachy or gossipy about any of this, and not to get you to, you know, use lawyers, but, you know, at base, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if, you know, for what's not a lot of work or time or effort, you can kind of get things off on the right foot pretty easily. And that's, you know, what we're talking about right now. You have access to resources that can help you, you know, sort of do the right thing from the outset. And if you do that, you can avoid some of the pitfalls that we'll talk about a little bit. I was talking to it was not a UNH startup, but I was talking to a group just the other day, and, you know, they formed the company in December, I think, and really didn't talk to anybody about it. And you know, what you end up with is, instead of having a vesting situation where, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but they ended up with a situation where if somebody leaves the company in the short term, they end up with a significant chunk of the company. And, you know, it's something that would be immediately apparent to somebody that has been through this a number of times. But it wasn't something that they considered or knew sort of what the various alternatives were to that sort of static situation that they set up. And, you know, it will be an issue that they need to work through. And had they sort of reached out initially and sort of gone through you know, had a little bit of assistance with that, it probably wouldn't have happened. You know, Facebook is a classic example of having issues early on that sort of, with regard to the ownership, that could have been handled a little bit better. And then, you know, issues arise later on in the company's, you know, life, that could have been avoided. So anyway, if you're going to be starting a company and you're at all interested in it, you know, reach out to Ian, reach out to myself, and we can get you on the right track. So next slide. So, you know, and again, if there's any questions or comments as we're going, feel free to jump in. We're all in our basements and dorm rooms and different places, and so I don't have a great sense of the crowd that whether you're all itching to ask questions or zoned out. So feel free to jump in. So when to form an entity, you know, really when you have an idea and when there are assets is when you want to form a legal entity. But, you know, definitely if there's more than one founder, because the relationship between those 2 or 3 or 4 people or more, you really want that to be governed by the entity's organizational documents, so that, you know, if Ian and I start a company, we know exactly that Ian owns 75% of it and I own 25% of it, and that he gets to call the shots on X, Y, and Z issues. And, you know, I understand that from the get-go, instead of, you know, it's unclear for whatever reason, and Ian thinks that he's allowed to not only sort of compete in this sphere that we're working on with this company, but he might have 2 or 3 other ventures that are ongoing that he thinks are okay, and that I might disagree with that. So anytime there's sort of multiple people involved in a situation, you want to form a legal entity and have those relationships spelled out. Similar, on a different vein, if there's oftentimes the IP is key to the value of the company, whether it's a patent or a trade secret, or just know-how with regard to a particular process or method or the like, you want to ensure that those ideas are owned by the legal entity that you're involved with. And one of the immediate things that we do when we're starting a company is that everybody that's involved in the venture signs an assignment of invention agreement, whereby they assign all of the IP that has anything to do with the company that everybody's working on to the legal entity. So the legal entity is the owner of that IP, as opposed to any of the individuals. And sometimes you'll run into a problem where you have 4 founders, they didn't sign an assignment of inventions agreements, and let's say it's a UNH startup, everything's going great while everybody's on campus, and then one of the founders gets a job and decides to go in a different direction, and they have material IP, and they either use it in another competing sphere, or the company that remains wants to sell itself, and the acquirer looks at the company and says, well, how do we know that this original nugget of code is owned by the legal entity? And they said, well, Tom was here, and he's the one that did that, and he's actually on the West Coast now, no longer involved with the company, and geez, wouldn't it be great if we had him sign an assignment of inventions? Now we need to reach out to him on the precipice of a potential sort of M&A transaction, and have him assign it. You could be in a situation where they won't do it, and it reflects in the value of the company, or they try to sort of hold you hostage for some sort of value in connection with the transaction. So anytime there's material IP involved, and you want to get it into that legal entity right at the outset. Another situation where it would be necessary or be hitting you in the face that you should have a legal entity formed would be just signing commercial contracts. You never want to sign commercial agreements in your own name. And oftentimes in the early stage of companies, people do that because they either just want to get things going, or are not knowing that it should be a legal entity. Similarly, for hiring employees, that should always be done through a legal entity. And then obviously just commercializing a product, typically the market would assume that it's sort of a business to business transaction, and or market practice or custom would indicate that businesses are typically doing business with other businesses. There are obviously circumstances where you're doing business with an individual, but if it's like a company to company situation, that would be the expectation. And then lastly, anytime you're raising capital, typically you're, I guess unless it's a really early stage, like friends and family funding situation, any type of institutional or professional investor is going to expect that there is a legal entity on the other side of the transaction, and they're going to be getting, for their capital, they're going to be getting an ownership interest in that legal entity, and that will sort of be clearly spelled out. So next slide. So the basics of when to form an entity, and then why would I do that? The base concept, probably, I guess more than any other, is that, or the one that people think of the most, is that if I form Jamie Baker Inc., anytime that legal entity or Jamie Baker LLC, enters into a transaction or takes an action in the marketplace, in the world, that's it. The legal entity is the quote unquote sort of legal party or legal person to that transaction. And if, when you're in college, you might not have as many assets that you want to protect. But if you're lucky, maybe you do, maybe you have, either significant savings or some real estate or a car, whatever assets you have, you don't want those things to be on the hook. If the business venture that you're entering into, somehow you're sued because of that. So typically it's that separation of, I want the legal entity to be sort of front and center as opposed to my personal assets. And that's probably the primary thing that a legal entity does for people, and why you set it up right at the get-go. So for liability protection, it obviously does the other things that are listed on the screen. It is the party to contracts. It owns assets. It incurs liabilities. If a company gets sued, it's the company that gets sued, not you personally. And, as mentioned, it allows you to raise capital, so it allows for investment. From a technical perspective, legal entities arise from state law. And so you can form a corporation or an LLC, or various other types of entities in every state in the country. And so if you're forming Google or Zoom or Ford, those are all just, you form that the same way that any of you would form a business if you started tomorrow. Those, oftentimes companies are formed in the state of Delaware, because the common wisdom is that the Delaware state case law with regard to corporate entities is the most developed, it's the most uniform, it's the most widely understood. But the corporate law or limited liability company law of every state largely follows the same path. And so, a legal entity formed in New Hampshire is largely the same as one that's formed in Delaware. It provides the same protections generally. And there are some sort of nuanced considerations that you might think about as to where you form a legal entity. But, at the end of the day, they're formed from state law. And, the additional nuances are probably, beyond the scope of this presentation. So for now, I guess we could leave that point at that. Are there any questions, comments before we keep rolling on here? All right, I guess we'll move to the next slide. So I mentioned this briefly. The types of entities that you could form: corporation, everybody's probably familiar with that. Limited liability company, and then and those are generally the entities that folks will form if they have a commercial venture. There's not a cut and dry difference between there's things that you can do to corporations to make them more like LLCs, and there's things that you can do to LLCs to make them more like corporations, but largely they're legal entities that protect the owners from personal liability. Corporations generally have an entity level tax. That's usually the first thing that you'll hear people mention about a corporation. And a limited liability company provides for pass-through taxation. But beyond that, they provide, liability protection. That's probably the most important point. Social ventures, nonprofits, B Corps, there's other types of LLCs out there. And I think we can go to the next slide. I think I'm touching on some of these things more deeply here. I won't read these slides. These slides are also intended to just if Ian can distribute them after the presentation, almost just as a quick primer on some of these points that you can refer back to and think about. There's a whole section on IP in the back of this that I'm not going to get into detail on today, but again, it's there for you just as a primer, and a good roadmap if you're thinking about some of these issues or thinking about starting a company. But with regard to the forms of the legal entities, corporations, LLCs, and nonprofits, those are going to cover 95% of any sort of business venture that you're likely to come across. Let me see what the next slide has. So generally, corporations, people oftentimes, you can lump corporations into, if you're going to be getting significant institutional or professional investment, you'll more often than not be in a corporate form. So you've heard of a preferred stock financing. Those are typically done in the corporate form. Series, you start out with common stock. The next level might be some type of preferred seed stock. And then, you might have heard of Series A financing, Series B financing, and those are preferred stock investment rounds. And those are all typically done sort of with regard to corporations or in corporations. LLCs are oftentimes thought of if you have a smaller group and you won't necessarily be taking on preferred institutional investment, and you want that pass-through taxation. Oftentimes real estate ventures, or sort of renewable energy projects, you're going to see a lot of LLCs in those contexts, but nothing. The baseline takeaway is probably, one of these, you want to form one of these and be doing business. You don't necessarily need to know all the distinctions and nuances. I think the important takeaway is get in touch with Ian at the e-center, and then ask him what his thoughts are on getting going and getting set up, and then getting in touch with a lawyer that can help you with some of this stuff with regard to formation. But there are these various types of entities that have nuances and distinctions. The key difference with a nonprofit, I'm not sure if I have this. The key difference with any of the social ventures is that, generally with regard to corporations and LLCs, the primary or the overarching theme or concept is that you're taking every action in order to maximize the profits or revenue that you're generating for the owners of that business, and you're not necessarily supposed to be taking into account kind of the ancillary considerations like societal goods or your employees or third parties. And any good business does take those things into account because they're important to the end result. But in a nonprofit context, you can explicitly and primarily take into account the good or the service or the mission of the organization, as opposed to just maximizing profits. So that's probably the primary takeaway when you're thinking about nonprofits versus corporations or LLCs. The next slide is, I might have gotten out of order here.
Ownership issues.
Yep, Ian, can you still hear me okay? I
can. It's ownership issues.
Okay, great. So this is, these are some of the things that I get into on a daily basis with groups out of UNH or other schools in New Hampshire, and frankly, not, not just sort of, startups coming out of sort of the university context, but any group of founders coming together have these same initial considerations. And it's fun and interesting and, sort of ever changing with the considerations that you, or the permutations of these situations that you wind up in. And so, you're starting a company, you have 3 or 4 people. Who is going to receive what and why? And so, I put sort of a quick example down here. Often, I think, I guess more often than not, the number of folks that are involved in sort of what we all think of as a classic startup situation is kind of 2 to 5 people, and probably more often than not 3 to 4. So I just threw in a very, very simple, sort of carving up of the equity and the way to think about this. And, somebody has the initial idea, somebody has done this before, and then somebody can write code. And the 3 folks come together and they want to join forces and start this company. That, I can't tell you the number of ways that gets divvied up, and the considerations that go into that. But this wouldn't be completely unusual to see it end up something like this. And so you end up, and so if this isn't done though, there's definitely a lack of clarity on what everybody's doing and what they're working for. But the primary consideration is, let's be clear about what everybody owns and what my interest in this enterprise is going to be. And I don't know if I mentioned vesting in here elsewhere, but the vesting concept is important. I mentioned it earlier. If 3 people start a company and you don't have any vesting on their ownership interest, if I decide to flake out and go surfing in Costa Rica for the next 3 years, absent, taking some action, I still own a third of that company, or, my 30% or 25% or the like. And if the remaining founders grow that business to, anything or something substantial, I still own a significant piece of that for not having done anything. And so we try to solve that problem by creating vesting. And what you do is you only get your 30% interest or your 25% interest if you stay involved with the business enterprise in a meaningful way. And there's different ways of defining that meaningful relationship. But you need to stay meaningfully involved in the enterprise in order to continue to gain your ownership. And so it's an important concept that you will, as soon as you get together with a group of folks and are thinking about this, you're the absolute stake and then the time over which it vests are primary considerations and important considerations. And then just a quick reference to, oftentimes the group of founders can't do everything forever, and you'll either need to bring on employees or third-party service providers, and oftentimes you're going to want to give them equity to do that because you're not going to have cash in the early stages. And so you can sort of carve out a chunk of the company to issue to those folks to incentivize them to do work for the company without needing to pay them cash. And so that's a key concept as well. So next slide. The owners of the company are ultimately entitled to the profits of the company, and the owners of the company vote for the board of directors or the board of managers in an LLC context, and the board of directors control the mission and the overall direction of the company, and they can delegate, some of the authority to run the company to officers, the president, the treasurer, the secretary, the vice president, the chief executive officer, the chief marketing officer, chief financial officer, to get things done on a day-to-day basis. But it's the board of directors ultimately that can hire or fire those people. And so early on, amongst the founders, or when you have investors coming on board, one of the key questions will be who gets to vote for the board of directors and who gets to be on the board of directors. And further than those points, who gets to ultimately control the board of directors? Because if you can elect a majority of the board, you can pretty much control what a company is going to be doing. So that's an early stage consideration. You'll hear mention of preemptive rights, which are an investor's or an owner's right to buy a portion of new securities offerings. The reason that's important is it allows any existing investor to continue to maintain the same percentage of the company, their same percentage ownership of the company. And if you think it's a great company and it's going in the right direction, and that you're getting good value as an investor, you would want the opportunity or the right to participate and purchase equity in subsequent rounds. And so people will negotiate for that right. And the next point, generally in an early stage company, when you have 2, 3, 4, 5 owners, you're not going to allow those people to transfer their ownership stakes. So, for example, Ian and I start a company. I know Ian really well. I know what he's good at. I know what he's capable of. But I would not want to necessarily be an owner along with Ian's friend who we went to college with. And so if Ian decides to transfer his shares or sell his shares to his friend, now all of a sudden I'm an owner, and along with a person that I didn't really make an explicit decision to go into business with. And so oftentimes you'll see that you're not allowed to, the transfer of securities is significantly restricted in an early stage company. And then being clear about what competitive activities the owners can and can't do while you're involved in a venture. Sometimes you deal with it explicitly, sometimes it's just an understanding, but it's something to consider depending on the space that you're in and what people have going on currently and sort of have done in the past.
Jamie, I'm just going to interrupt for a second with two questions for you. If your shares vest over 5 years and the company sells in 3 years, do the shares vest fully?
That is a good question. It was if your shares vest over 5 years and the company sold in year 3, do you get credit for all of your shares or just a portion of them? And the short answer is, it's likely that in an early stage company, those shares would it's called acceleration, and those shares, you would get credit for all of the shares that you own. The vesting would be accelerated in connection with the transaction, but it's not a foregone conclusion. And so if sometimes they'll explicitly provide that for exactly that circumstance that you described, it's explicit that there's 100% acceleration in the event of a transaction. That can be viewed, depending on the circumstances, as a windfall for the party that would be accelerating in full. And so sometimes, you don't explicitly provide for that, but you might leave it up to the discretion of, the owners or the board to accelerate the equity in particular circumstances. But so that the short answer is it's really a negotiated point that may or may not go in sort of one of a couple directions. But it's definitely a point that is important and, can be dealt with in various ways.
Right. And another question is it smart to have the founder of a company be in control of the board of directors?
Yeah, that if you're the founder, it's definitely smart. And if you can control the board, it's definitely, from your perspective, it would be beneficial. So there are, I don't know, I can't, I was going to try and make a dangerous generalization, but there are a number of companies where the founder is able to retain significant control. It's probably less frequent the bigger the company gets, but not definitely so, because there are some, really large companies that are owned and controlled by one, individual or group of sort of associated, affiliates. And so what oftentimes happens though is, as the company grows and as you take on investment, there's a broadening of the board of directors and a broadening of, instead of one person that can control, one or two or three directorships and sort of have complete say-so, even if they retain a majority of the company, an investor may say, we either want you get one investor, you get one director, we get one director, and then we'll both agree on a third independent director. And that, that's really where the rubber hits the road on all the control issues. So it's a great question. And the shorter answer is, everybody, whether you're a founder or an investor, tries to have as much control on the board of directors as they possibly can. Most often, again, as the company evolves and grows and takes on more investment, the founder or the founding group is going to find themselves, no longer able to completely control that board of directors. And so, you may very importantly have 2 out of 5 director seats, and those are really important meetings, and you want your views to be heard at that level, and you're able to hear other views, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to control the decision. So, because 3 people can outvote 2, and then, generally you're going to have majority decision making at the board level. So the control of the board is, the end of no, or, there is just, it's constantly dealt with, negotiated, the point of much contention. But in these early stages, if you have 2 or 3 or 4 people starting a company, they're probably all going to have a board seat or be on the board of managers. And so, beyond the scope of this presentation, but the dynamics become really important. If you know that you're generally on the 3 side, and that there's one person that's generally, he's always going to have, he or she is always going to have different thoughts. But ultimately, we're not so concerned about that because we think we can outvote them. Or, there's 2 people on one side of every issue and 2 people on the other, and they're going to be at loggerheads constantly. And so the way that you have to kind of think about the future and the way that things may play out, it's kind of a chess match, and you don't know exactly how it's going to go. But you try for as much certainty as possible. And that's, that's the art of the negotiation, I guess, in some of these early stage companies and formations.
All right, so just a time check, about 8 minutes, and then we'll do a wrap up. Just leave some time for Q&A and some other things. So if there's certain slides you want me to hit, JP, just. Yeah,
great. I can, so this, I'm looking at the same slide. I can hit this very quickly. A friends and family financing could be, any one of the folks on this Zoom going to your parents and saying, I have an amazing idea. I'm going to start up a fishing charter down in Portsmouth during the summers. Can you loan me $15,000, to get all the supplies lined up, etc. That's really what a friends and family round is. It could be a technology, it could be a service, it could be a lawn mowing business. It's sort of the most friendly and easiest way to raise money. Bootstrapping, you're just figuring it out yourself. You have 3 different jobs going, and every dollar you make is getting thrown into the business. Kickstarter, Indiegogo are kind of ways to crowdfund money for particular products or ideas. Peer-to-peer lending is exactly what it sounds like, and it's folks lending money to each other to fund ideas or to fund any number of things. Crowdfunding is taking a whole bunch of what would generally be considered sort of smaller investment amounts and then aggregating them into what can be a more significant amount for a company. Angel and seed rounds, generally it's kind of like your first professional investment round, and will take on a little bit more formality. SBIR grants, great way to get funding if you can do it under certain circumstances. Business partners, sometimes businesses will invest in other businesses to either create a technology or to further the development of a technology. Venture capital, you've all heard of in some form or fashion. Professional investors putting money into companies to get returns. Private IPOs have been more frequent over the past couple of years. Of companies have not IPO'd as much or as frequently, but that market is changing, and IPOs are kind of back in vogue to some degree in various forms lately. And it's the most sexy and publicized form of raising money. And then there's debt, which is a great way to fund a company if you can do it. Pass on the next slide is securities law considerations. Important to know that they're out there and that there are laws that you need to comply with when you're raising money at the state and federal level. But you can rely on a lawyer to do that stuff for you and to keep you on the right track. It's just it's good to know that they're out there and that there is this whole paradigm of regulation that needs to be sort of navigated. And then the last slide I'll touch on, common early stage agreements that you'll either hear referenced or be dealing with. NDAs, term sheets kind of lay out the basics of a deal. Offer letter, employment agreement situations, leases. Everybody needs space. Maybe not as much nowadays. We'll see how that goes. I mentioned assignment of inventions and services for any number of different types of services a business would need. So there's also a whole section on the basics of some IP concepts on the backside of this slide deck. So use that, and to the extent it raises any issues or answers any questions for you, that's great. But it's just meant as a little bit of a primer in that area. It's oftentimes right along with the business considerations or some of the IP considerations that the early stage companies have. So I'll stop there for tonight.
Right. There's another question, Jamie. Have you worked with companies raising equity through crowdfunding? And if so, what are your thoughts about the pros and cons of doing it that way?
Yeah, I have. And it's still not, it hasn't taken off the way that many people thought it might. It's becoming a bigger part of the fundraising scene, and it can be an important way to raise money, but it still is not, I don't know, I'm sure the gross numbers are large with regard to, how much money is raised in the aggregate through crowdfunding. But I just don't see it used as sort of one of the primary methods of raising money. But that said, I have seen it used successfully and without issue. And in particular, one company that I work with that I'm thinking of, that appears to be, poised for significant growth, used that as a method to keep going and, raise some money and then did some subsequent financing rounds. And so I've seen it used successfully, but it's not as common yet as it may be in the future.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Jason asked, we'll share the presentation with anyone. So I know Derek, not surprising, Jason, I know you want one as well. So if you like the presentation, we'll forward that. So just let us know. Any other questions? So obviously what you learn is it's not easy and you absolutely need professional help. And Jamie really just scratched the surface on this. And so it's one of the reasons that we partnered with Pierce Atwood, is to be able to help you as you move your ideas along into company formation, to do that, because it is ripe with disaster and you need somebody to help you. So any other questions in the meantime? I can't see anybody, so I'm gonna have to have you. Okay, there we go. If you have a business plan outside the area of your expertise, what portion equity should you offer to the joining two members who do have that needed expertise? So you bring in an expert that you don't have, even though it wasn't their idea, or they maybe not were originally part of the founders.
Yeah. Ian, you could probably answer that one. Or there's definitely different considerations that go into that. It's a great question. I'd say you want to give them as little as you need to in order to get them to jump into the program and to help you move things along, but without knowing precisely sort of what value is coming from each person. It's hard to answer that with specificity.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to say that if you require that person in order to continue with your idea, then it is about the value. So you just need to weigh that in. And, a rule of thumb is just not to be too greedy, to take a look at the bigger picture, that, a smaller percentage of a much more successful company is better than a larger percentage of something that ends up having no value.
Good point.
So a couple more questions. Now they're flying in. What kind of budget should be set aside to work with a law firm of these preliminary agreements and setups?
Sorry.
So, like, how much should be set aside to create some of the initial agreements?
Oh, okay. For eCenter companies, nothing. So it's a great deal. It's the right price. But you can get. It's hard to say with specificity. You can form an entity and have some really basic protections set up for $500 to $1,000. When you start putting any sort of bells and whistles on that, the cost would go up a bit. But it's definitely, it depends on a lot of facts and circumstances, but it doesn't need to be a lot of money to get some basic protection.
And I will just echo that Jamie and Pierce Atwood have generously donated their time to help student companies who, again, you have to go through customer discovery and some validation. It's not just you have a random idea. There's some levels of threshold you have to do, but again, reach out to me, and a number of companies have taken advantage of that. Student companies who have taken advantage of that. So, and we're very grateful for that. So we have a couple minutes left. Another question before we just wrap things up. What's your preferred way for a startup to raise capital? Do you see a preferred way, Jamie?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of financial advisors would tell you that debt is the best way to do it if you can do it. But oftentimes when you're at really early stages, banks or the like will not be willing to lend you money. And so, then typically you're looking at some type of preferred equity to raise capital. Sometimes you can do a common equity funding, which is great if you can do it. But more often than not, it's going to be some sort of preferred equity and the reason it's preferred, when I say that, it's in a sale transaction or a liquidity transaction, the preferred stock gets their money back before the common stock gets anything, and that's the preferred protection. They also, the preferred stock retains its upside by saying, if it's a fantastic transaction, I'm not just limited to getting my money back. I get, whatever the common stock would get when you kind of fully dilute everything out. But yeah, more often than not, it's going to be some type of equity financing.
Great. All right. So if I could ask a favor for everyone, if you could all unmute for a second for me. I'm just going to wait for everyone to do that. So big round of applause for Jamie for taking the time on a Monday. So thank you very much, Jamie.
Looks like it.
Thank you.
So great. And then again, Jamie's a great resource. If you have more questions, we can put you in touch, or maybe Jamie can hang out for a couple minutes afterwards.